October 1945, Central Texas. The air was hotter than anything I had ever felt in Europe. It smelled of dust, hay, and something sweet I later learned was mesquite. The train had stopped on a siding that cut through endless fields, and as the doors opened, sunlight poured in like a physical thing, sharp and gold. We had crossed an ocean to get here. Weeks earlier, I was one of hundreds of German prisoners loaded onto a Liberty ship in Le Havre, bound for a country we'd only heard about through rumor and propaganda. We expected humiliation, maybe starvation. The Atlantic crossing had been long and silent. No one spoke much. We thought America would hate us the way we had been taught to hate them. When the guards ordered us off the train, I stepped down into blinding light and heard crickets louder than artillery. U.S. Army trucks waited beside the track. The soldiers wore broad-brimmed hats instead of helmets and joked in slow English that I barely understood. I remember thinking they looked like they'd come from a movie. We were driven down a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. Cotton fields rolled by, dotted with windmills and cattle. When we reached the camp, I saw barbed wire and wooden towers, but also a whitewashed chapel, a baseball field, and rows of barracks painted pale green. A sign at the gate read, Camp Hearne, U.S. Army POW branch. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a small town. Diary entry, October 12, 1945. They call this Texas. The sky is too big. Even the air feels free. I don't understand how captivity can smell like freedom. Inside the gate, American soldiers lined us up. A captain with sun-cracked skin and mirrored sunglasses shouted something about rules, then added almost kindly, "You'll eat, you'll work, you'll be fine if you behave." His accent stretched the words like taffy. We were issued denim shirts, stenciled PW on the back, and canvas hats that looked ridiculous. Then came the first shock. Lunch. Real bread, butter, beans, and slices of beef. I hadn't seen meat since the winter of '44. I ate slowly, suspicious, waiting for the cruelty that never came. Afterward, a guard asked my name for the roster. "Johann Meyer," I said. He smiled. "Well, John, welcome to Texas." I didn't know enough English to reply, but something in his tone, not mockery, not triumph, made me straighten my shoulders. That evening, we were marched to the compound's edge to watch the sun go down. The horizon burned orange and purple, and for the first time since capture, I felt quiet instead of fear. Somewhere beyond the wire, a cowboy on horseback rode along the fence line, checking cattle. His silhouette looked carved from the setting sun. Later, in the barracks, an older prisoner named Carl whispered, "They treat us like guests, it's a trick." "Maybe," I said, "but even a trick tastes better than hunger." The next morning, we learned about the work program. Local ranchers could request prisoners to help harvest cotton, repair fences, or tend cattle. The Americans paid the army 50 cents a day for each man. We received a few coupons to spend at the camp canteen. I didn't believe it until they handed me a shovel and put me in the back of a pickup truck. That truck ride is burned into my memory. The road shimmered with heat. The driver, a Texan in his 50s, wearing a sweat-stained Stetson, chewed tobacco and hummed something that sounded like a hymn. When he saw me watching, he grinned. "You ever seen real cows, son?" I shook my head. "Well, you're gonna meet a few thousand." The ranch was huge, miles of pasture fenced with barbed wire, dotted with oak trees. The air buzzed with insects. The other prisoners and I worked under a broad sky that seemed to have no edges. The cowboy shouted directions, mixing German words he'd learned from earlier groups. "Schnell, but not too schnell," and laughed at his own joke. At noon, he brought out tin pails filled with water and sandwiches, real bread again, thick slices of smoked beef and mustard. He gestured for us to sit under a tree. "Eat," he said. "Texas hospitality." I hesitated, still expecting mockery. He noticed and added softer, "War's over, boy. Ain't no use starving." That was the first time I heard the phrase, "war's over," said like a blessing instead of a warning. Diary entry, October 20th. Today I worked beside a man who could have shot me a year ago. We shared food instead. His hands are twice the size of mine. He smells of horses and tobacco, and when he laughs, it shakes the air. Back in camp that evening, the guards allowed us to play soccer on the dusty field. They watched from the fence, some cheering, some laughing, when the ball went astray. One tossed us an old baseball afterward and tried to show us how to throw it properly. The language didn't matter, the gestures did. That night, the barracks were quiet except for the buzz of cicadas. I lay on my bunk and thought about the cowboy who had handed me a sandwich and called me son. I had been ready to hate him, but I couldn't. His kindness didn't fit any category I knew. In Germany, I'd been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, obsessed with money. Yet here was a man who worked harder than any soldier I'd met, who treated strangers with humor instead of suspicion, who whistled while loading hay under a sun that could kill you. The next day, he greeted me with the same lazy grin. "Morning, Hans," he said. "Ready to ride?" I pointed to myself, confused. He nodded toward a calm, brown horse. "Don't worry. She's gentler than most folks I know." I had never ridden a horse. He lifted me by the arm, easily as if I weighed nothing, and set me in the saddle. "Just hold on," he said. When the horse started walking, I felt a strange rush of freedom inside the fences of captivity. Later, when we returned to camp, the sergeant checking us in said, "How's Texas treating you, Maya?" I answered carefully, "Very large." He laughed. "That's one way to put it." That night, as the sun bled into the horizon again, I realized I hadn't thought about home all day, not because I'd forgotten, but because for the first time in years, the world had stopped feeling like punishment. Diary entry, October 23rd. I think mercy has a drawl. It sounds like Texas. If you're listening to this and it surprises you, remember this. Sometimes kindness comes from the last place you expect. If this story made you see the other side of the war a little differently, take a moment to share it, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps these memories stay alive. By the end of October, Texas had worked its way under my skin. The sun rose so violently each morning that the horizon seemed to burn. By noon, the light bleached everything until color itself gave up. The air shimmered above the dirt roads. Even the shadows looked tired. And yet, every dawn, I found myself eager to climb onto the back of the army truck that carried us out of the compound and into the open world. We called it the Ride to Freedom. Each day, 10 of us prisoners were assigned to the same ranch 20 miles north of Hearne, a spread of thousands of acres owned by a man named Tom Grady. He was a lean, weathered Texan with skin like saddle leather and a voice that rolled slower than the wind. The guards called him Mr. Tom, though he wasn't military. He had agreed to employ POW labor for the cotton harvest and fence repairs. The first time we arrived, he tipped his hat and said, "Morning, boys. Don't wreck my fence and we'll get along fine." Then he laughed, a deep, easy laugh that made even the guards smile. That was how it began. Work started before the heat became unbearable. We hauled barbed wire, mended gates, lifted heavy fence posts. Sweat soaked our shirts within minutes. The smell of sun-baked soil, manure, and hay mixed with the metallic tang of sweat and rusted tools. The noise was rhythmic, hammers striking, wire stretching, cattle lowing in the distance. At first, we moved stiffly, afraid to make mistakes, but the cowboys, 4 of them, all locals, treated us like clumsy cousins instead of enemies. They teased each other constantly. "Hey, Fritz!" one shouted at me during my first week. "You swing that hammer like you're playing a violin." The others laughed. I didn't understand the joke, but their laughter was not cruel. When I smiled back, they nodded, as if to say, "Now you're getting it." Diary entry, October 30th. They don't hate us. They don't even seem to think about hate. These men are too busy with the business of being alive. Each noon, the heat forced us to stop. We'd sit under a live oak while Tom Grady's wife, a tall woman in a blue dress, drove out in a dusty pickup truck with a big metal cooler in the back. She'd hand us tin plates loaded with cornbread, beans, and smoked beef, real beef, seasoned with something sweet and peppery. I could have wept from the smell alone. Once she noticed me watching the sky as a hawk circled high above. "You ever seen one of those in Germany?" she asked. I hesitated, then said, "Not like that." She smiled. "Everything's bigger here, even the birds." Her tone was friendly, not boastful. That was Texas, proud, without cruelty. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the creek, I cut my hand badly on a strand of barbed wire. Blood soaked the cloth around my palm. Before I could even react, one of the cowboys, a young man named Ray, barely older than me, grabbed a rag from his saddlebag, poured whiskey on it, and wrapped my hand tight. "Don't go fainting now, Hans," he said. I grimaced from the sting. "Whiskey, strong medicine," he laughed. "Best kind we got." That night, back in camp, the guards inspected my hand and nodded approval. "You're lucky," one said. "Out here, folks fix what's broken. Doesn't matter whose flag you used to salute." I thought about that sentence for days. By November, the rhythm of our lives had settled. Work, eat, return, sleep. And yet, within that repetition, something remarkable grew. A quiet respect between the prisoners and the Texans. The guards no longer rode with rifles at the ready. Sometimes they didn't even come into the fields, trusting us to finish the day's labor. One afternoon, they even let us ride the horses back to the main gate. I remember gripping the reins of a chestnut mare and realizing that no one was watching me closely anymore. I could have run, but I didn't want to. Freedom had changed its meaning. On Sundays, the ranch families sometimes invited a small group of prisoners to help at the church picnic. The first time I stepped into that small wooden church, the sound of hymns startled me. Deep, slow voices filling the warm air. I stood in the back, silent, not understanding the words, but feeling their weight. Afterward, an old man handed me a plate of peach pie and said, "You ain't got to believe to eat, son." It was impossible to imagine this kindness in Europe after what we had seen. That evening, as we rode back to camp, the truck rattled past endless fields, glowing orange in the sunset. Carl leaned close to me and whispered, "If they knew what we did in France, they'd never feed us." I looked at him and said quietly, "Maybe they choose not to remember." He frowned. "Why?" "Because remembering would ruin them." Diary entry, November 8th. The Americans are not innocent, but they are unburdened. They live without the weight we carry. Perhaps that is why they seem so large. As winter approached, the air cooled. The camp canteen began selling hot coffee and small pastries baked by local volunteers. We could buy them with our coupons. I still remember the taste of that first slice of pie. Cinnamon, apples, warmth. I wrote home through the Red Cross. "I am safe. The Americans feed us. They laugh often. The sky is endless." One evening, as the light faded, Ray, the cowboy, handed me a harmonica. "You play?" he asked. I shook my head. "Then learn," he said. "You'll need something to do when you go home." He showed me how to blow single notes, laughing when I made it squeal. Before long, a few of us prisoners had a small band, accordion, harmonica, and a borrowed guitar. We played German folk songs at dusk, and sometimes, when the guards were in a good mood, they'd answer with American tunes. The music mixed over the fence until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It was strange. Peace disguised as sound. Then came Thanksgiving. We didn't know what it meant at first. The camp commander announced it over the loudspeaker. "Tomorrow is an American holiday. You'll have the day off. The local church has prepared a meal." That morning, trucks took us to a community hall near town. Long tables were covered in white cloths, each place set with plates, silverware, and steaming bowls of food. Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, sweet corn, and something called pumpkin pie. The smell was overwhelming. Butter, spice, roasted meat. An old preacher stood and said a prayer we couldn't understand. Then he smiled and gestured for us to eat. No one moved at first. The idea that we, the defeated, could share a holiday with the victors felt like blasphemy. But when the Americans began passing plates, we followed. A boy, maybe 10 years old, sat across from me, staring wide-eyed. Finally he said, "You're the German?" "Yes," I said carefully. He grinned. "Pa says y'all work hard. He says you fix fences better than we do." I laughed. "We had much practice." He nodded solemnly. "Well, you can eat like us too." That boy handed me a piece of pumpkin pie. And that was the moment I realized what victory really looked like. Not triumph, but generosity. Diary entry, November 23rd. They fed us turkey. They prayed for peace. I have never felt smaller or more human. That night, when we returned to camp, the guards didn't count us right away. They let us sit outside and smoke. Someone started humming a tune, not a German song, not American, just sound in the cool air. I closed my eyes and thought of home, but the picture that came wasn't my ruined town in Bavaria. It was the Texas sky at sunset, wide enough to hold forgiveness. As winter deepened, rumors spread that some prisoners would soon be repatriated. I wasn't sure how I felt. Germany meant rubble and hunger. Texas meant dignity, work, laughter, and men who called me Hans, like a brother. The day after the rumor, I saw Ray again at the ranch. He was oiling his saddle when he looked up and said, "So you leavin' soon?" "Maybe," I said. He spat a line of tobacco juice and smiled sadly. "Well, don't forget what you learned here." I frowned. "What did I learn?" He grinned. "That a man's worth ain't in the flag he fights for, but how he treats the fella standing next to him." That night, back in the barracks, I wrote those words down carefully in my diary. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. The wind smelled of cedar and smoke. And for the first time since I wore a uniform, I prayed, not to win, not for forgiveness, but simply to stay human a little longer. If you can still hear my voice across time, remember this. The greatest kindness I ever knew came from men who wore hats instead of helmets. If that surprises you, share this story and keep the memory of mercy alive where it's hardest to find. December 1945 came to Texas with a kind of stillness I had never known. The air was sharp in the mornings, but soft by noon, the light pale and forgiving. The war in Europe had ended 7 months earlier, yet for us, the German prisoners left behind, peace felt like a season that hadn't quite arrived. We were no longer enemies, but not yet free men. By then, I had been in Texas for nearly 3 months. The days had settled into a pattern as sure as the sunrise. Morning roll call, the rattle of the trucks, the long drive to the ranch, and the smell of horses and cedar when we stepped down from the flatbeds. The ranch had become as familiar as home. The same stretch of fence, the same horizon that never seemed to end, and the same American voices that called me Hans instead of Meyer. I had stopped translating my thoughts in my head. I thought half in English now, half in German. I suppose that was the first sign that I belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. The morning frost painted the fence posts white. My breath came out in clouds as I loaded wire coils into the truck. "Cold enough for you?" Ray called from the other side, his hat pulled low over his ears. I smiled. In Germany, this would be summer. He laughed, slapped his gloves together and said, "Guess I ain't moving there." Oh, we worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of the hammer hitting posts echoing across the fields. Every so often, a cow lowed somewhere in the distance. I liked the sound. It was alive, honest. Not like the hum of war machines or the orders barked through loudspeakers back home. When noon came, Mrs. Grady's pickup rolled across the field again, its tires cutting deep into the frost. She stepped down, carrying a basket covered in a checkered cloth. "Got something special for y'all," she said. Inside were tin cups of steaming coffee and biscuits dripping with honey. The smell alone made my knees weak. "You treat prisoners too well, ma'am," I said carefully. She shrugged. "You're men, ain't you? Men get hungry." I bit into the biscuit and closed my eyes. It was the first taste of sweetness I'd had in years, the kind that melted slowly on the tongue, the kind you didn't realize you'd missed until it returned. That night, back in the barracks, the guards brought in a small Christmas tree, pine needles still damp, tinsel made from aluminum scraps. Someone from the Red Cross had arranged it, they said. The men gathered around, awkwardly at first. One of the older prisoners began to hum Stille Nacht. Others joined in. Their voices filled the wooden room, low and trembling. For a moment, it was December in Germany again. When the song ended, we heard clapping outside the window. A few of the guards stood there, smiling. One called out, "Sing another, boys. We like that one." So we did. But halfway through, another sound joined ours, a harmonica, playing softly from the dark. It was Ray. He had come to the fence, his breath fogging in the cold, keeping time with us. And that was how I spent Christmas Eve, singing carols with Americans under a Texas sky filled with stars. Diary entry, December 24th, 1945. We sang for our dead, but also for our captors. The wind carried both prayers together. Perhaps God no longer bothers with flags. After Christmas, the camp settled into quiet waiting. Rumors of repatriation spread again. Some said the British were already shipping prisoners back through New York. Others whispered that those of us who had confessed to being Nazi party members might have to stay longer for denazification. For the first time in months, the thought of leaving didn't feel like salvation. It felt like exile. I spent more time at the ranch than ever, helping Tom Grady mend a collapsed windmill. He liked to talk while we worked. His stories always began the same way. Back when I was riding the trail. Once, I asked him why he'd agreed to employ prisoners. He squinted at the horizon, spat, and said, "Because somebody's got to teach y'all that America's not just bombers and bullets, and maybe you'll tell your folks that someday." He didn't say it like a lecture. He said it like a wish. That night, I wrote those words in my diary and stared at them until the ink blurred. I wondered what I would tell my country if I ever saw it again. That America was loud and enormous, yes, but also full of people who smiled easily, who didn't know how to hate efficiently, who measured a man by his work and his handshake instead of his past. In January, the snow came, a rare thing in that part of Texas. We woke to find the camp blanketed in white. The guards laughed, the prisoners cheered, and for an hour the war vanished completely. Men threw snowballs across the fence, Germans against Americans, the air filled with laughter instead of bullets. I saw the camp commander himself get hit squarely in the chest. He cursed, then joined the fight. It was the most ridiculous, beautiful thing I had ever seen. But the days grew long again, and the waiting began to gnaw at us. We didn't know if we were leaving next week or next year. Work continued, but without purpose. One afternoon, I stood by the fence watching a herd of cattle move across the horizon like brown waves. Ray walked up beside me. "You look homesick, Hans." "I don't know what home means anymore," I said. He thought about that, chewing a blade of grass. "Home's where folks call your name and mean it." I nodded slowly. "Then maybe I have two homes now." He smiled. "Nothing wrong with that." The next day, a new group of prisoners arrived, men captured in Italy who hadn't seen freedom since 1943. They were thin, bitter, and suspicious of the Americans. One night I overheard them complaining. "They make us pets," one said. "They feed us, but we are still in cages." I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. The wire still stood, the guards still carried rifles, and freedom was still something granted, not earned. But when I closed my eyes, I could still taste honey biscuits, and I thought that sometimes a cage with kindness is the first step toward an open door. In February, the Red Cross sent word. Transport schedules were being arranged. Germany was divided, cities in ruins. No one knew where we would land. Some men cheered, others cried. I felt both at once. Before we left, Tom Grady hosted a farewell barbecue on his ranch. He invited all the POWs who had worked for him, along with the guards. The air was thick with smoke and laughter. Music played from a crackling radio. "Never thought I'd be grilling meat for Germans," Ray said, flipping steaks with a grin. "Never thought I'd be eating it," I replied. We laughed until tears ran down our faces. When it was time to go, Tom shook my hand. "You did good work, son. You go home and fix your fences over there." I nodded, unable to speak. He pressed something into my hand, a small silver horseshoe keychain. "For luck," he said. That night, back in camp, I held it under the dim light and realized my hands no longer looked like those of a soldier. They were the hands of a worker, a builder, maybe even a friend. Diary entry, February 28th, 1946. I have learned more about peace from a man with a rope and a horse than from any officer I ever served. Tomorrow we leave. I don't know if Germany can forgive itself, but I have already started to forgive. The morning of departure came cold and bright. We boarded the same trains that had brought us months before. The guards called our names with the same voices, but their tone had changed. Less command, more farewell. As the wheels began to turn, I looked out the window. Ray stood by the fence, waving his hat. The horseshoe keychain was warm in my palm. I didn't wave back right away. I wanted to remember him like that, a silhouette in the Texas sun, laughing, enormous, alive. Then I raised my hand and said softly, "Auf Wiedersehen." He couldn't hear me, but he waved again anyway. And as the train pulled away, the land stretched out in every direction, open, endless, forgiving. And I understood that captivity had not broken me. It had remade me. If this story reached you, if it made you picture the world as it was, when men on opposite sides learned to shake hands instead of aim rifles, then keep it alive. Share it, tell someone younger, or write it down. Because the only thing larger than the Texas sky was the mercy I found beneath it. March 1946. The train left Texas under a sky so wide it could have swallowed the whole world. From the window, the last silhouettes of the ranch faded. A few barns, the outline of windmills, and the red dirt roads that had once carried us to freedom inside captivity. The land seemed to wave goodbye without moving. We were heading north, toward the ports where the ships waited. New Orleans first, then across the Atlantic. The guards said we were lucky. The war was over, we were going home. But the word home had become fragile in my mind. An old photograph that didn't quite fit the present anymore. In the train car, silence settled among the prisoners. Some stared out at the passing cotton fields, others smoked in quiet thought. A few sang softly, songs from childhood that sounded like ghosts now. I held the small silver horseshoe keychain in my palm, Tom Grady's gift. It felt heavier than metal. It was the weight of everything I didn't know how to say. At night, we stopped near a depot where Red Cross volunteers handed out coffee. American soldiers stood nearby, smiling, offering cigarettes. I accepted one, even though I didn't smoke much. "Where you from?" one asked. "Bavaria," I said. He grinned. "Heard it's cold there. Stay warm on that boat, friend." Friend. That word had never felt so strange or so right. When we reached New Orleans, the air smelled of salt and magnolia. The port was alive with noise, cranes groaning, seagulls screaming, soldiers shouting instructions in a dozen accents. The Liberty ship that waited for us was grey, streaked with rust, but to my eyes it looked magnificent. It meant passage, not just across the ocean, but from one life to another. We boarded in silence. The Americans lined the dock, watching. Some waved. One of the guards, Sergeant Miller, who'd spent months counting us every morning, lifted his cap and called out, "Good luck, boys, no hard feelings." A few prisoners shouted, "Danke!" I couldn't speak. My throat closed. As the ship pulled away, the city lights shimmered across the dark water like fireflies. Someone began humming a tune, not military, not solemn. It was, "You Are My Sunshine." We'd learned it from Ray, the cowboy, who used to whistle it while mending fences. Without thinking, I joined in. So did half the men on deck. Our voices blended with the sound of the ship's engines, floating out into the warm night. The American guards waved until we were small points on the horizon. The crossing took 2 weeks. The sea was calm, but the air was heavy with thoughts no one wanted to speak aloud. We were free men in name, yet none of us knew what waited beyond the waves. Rumors said Germany was rubble, cities turned to skeletons. Some said the Americans and British were already rebuilding schools and factories. Others whispered about hunger, revenge, and Russians. At night I lay in my bunk listening to the hum of the engines and thought about Texas. The ranch, the smell of mesquite, the taste of honey biscuits, the way the cowboys laughed without fear. The rhythm of their speech echoed in my mind. It wasn't music, but it had become a kind of prayer. Diary entry, March 10th, 1946. I am sailing east, but my heart is still pointed west. The country that captured me taught me how to be free. When we finally saw Europe again, the coast was grey and wind-scoured. The ship docked in Le Havre, where the journey had begun nearly a year before. From there we were herded onto smaller trains headed for Germany. No brass bands, no flags, no welcome. Just silence and smoke. The stations we passed through were barely standing, roofs collapsed, windows shattered. Children stood barefoot on the platforms, holding tin cups for food that never came. Women carried buckets from broken wells. Men in patched uniforms stared without expression. It wasn't the Germany I remembered. It wasn't even the one I had fought for. It was a wound still bleeding. When we arrived in Bavaria, I almost didn't recognize my own town. The church steeple was gone. The bakery where my father once worked was a pile of stones. The air smelled of wet ash. My brother found me 2 days later. He had survived by trading wood for bread. His hair was grey, though he was younger than me. When I told him where I'd been, he stared for a long time, then said quietly, "You were lucky." "Yes," I said, "but not only lucky. I was changed." We lived in the ruins and tried to rebuild. I helped clear bricks, plant potatoes, repair roofs. At night, people gathered around fires, telling stories about those lost, those who returned, and those who would never come back. When I spoke of America, most people didn't believe me. They thought I was exaggerating, that no victor would treat prisoners kindly, that cowboys and farm wives could show mercy after such a war. One man spat and said, "They had to act good. It was politics." I didn't argue. He hadn't seen the look in Tom Grady's eyes when he handed me food, or the way Ray laughed as if war was a thing that couldn't touch the soil of Texas. But in my heart, I knew the truth. Mercy had not been policy. It had been character. Months passed. Spring came. The fields began to bloom again, shyly like a child learning to walk. One morning, while repairing a neighbor's roof, I heard an airplane overhead. I looked up instinctively, bracing for bombs. Instead, a supply plane roared by, dropping crates with the white star painted on their sides. U.S. relief. Bread fell from the sky that day. I sat on the roof beam, watching the parachutes drift down like seeds, and thought, even now, they feed us. That night I opened my diary for the first time since the voyage. The pages smelled faintly of salt and oil. I turned to the back and wrote, "They say victory belongs to those who stand last. But maybe it belongs to those who choose not to hate when they could." In 1947, a letter arrived from America. It was addressed simply, Johann Meyer, Bavaria, Germany. The envelope was covered in stamps and dust. Inside was a photograph of Ray and Tom Grady standing beside a horse, smiling under the same endless sky. On the back, in slanted handwriting, it said, "Hope you fixed those fences. Texas still remembers you, Ray." I stared at the picture until tears blurred the faces. Then I took out the silver horseshoe keychain and hung it by my bed. It still hangs there now, rusted and worn, a relic from a time when the world was both cruel and kind enough to make sense again. Diary entry, April 2nd, 1947. The Americans called themselves Cowboys. I used to think it meant rough men with ropes and guns. Now I know it means something else. Men who look at the horizon and believe tomorrow will be better, even for their enemies. Years later, when I married and had a son, I told him stories of that camp in Texas. He asked, "Didn't you hate them for keeping you prisoner?" I thought about the fences, the laughter, the smell of bread in the mornings. "No," I said, "they kept me human." Sometimes when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the Texas wind, dry, warm, and wide enough to forgive. And even now, in old age, when people ask me what freedom tastes like, I smile and answer without hesitation, "It tastes like coffee, biscuits, and dust. It tastes like mercy served under a cowboy hat." If this story found a place in your heart, share it. Tell someone that after the guns fell silent, kindness kept the world alive. Subscribe, leave a thought, or carry this memory forward, so that when history forgets, humanity remembers.